He had moved through the new chamber, a high, vaulted gallery dimly lit with pools of gold-yellow light. For the first time since Spark had dragged him here, he had a moment of respite. Ever since entering the library, the Spartan's head had been on a swivel. Wave after wave of hostile creatures had attacked him from all sides. He popped a stim pack, downed a nutrient supplement, and gathered up his weapon. Time to move out. As he proceeded deeper into the library, he found a corpse, a human one. He stooped to examine the body. It wasn't pretty. The Marine's body was so mangled that even the Flood couldn't make use of him. He lay at the centre of a large blood stain wreathed by spent brass. "Ah," 343 Guilty Spark said, peering down over the Spartan's shoulder. "The other Reclaimer. His combat skin proved even less suitable than yours." The soldier looked up over his shoulder. "What do you mean? Is this a test, Reclaimer?" The monitor seemed genuinely puzzled. "I found him wandering through a structure on the other side of the ring, and brought him to the same point where you started." The chief looked down at the body and marvelled at the fact that anyone could make it that far. Even with his physical augmentation and the advantages of his armour, the Spartan was reaching the end of his endurance. He checked, found the leatherneck's dog tags, and read the name. Mobuto, Marvin, Staff Sergeant, followed by a service number. The chief put the tags away. "I didn't know you, Sarge, but I sure as hell wish I had. You must have been one hardcore son of a bitch." It wasn't much as eulogies go, but he hoped that, had Sergeant Marvin Mobuto had been there to hear it, he would have approved. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and Thursday last week I was watching a buddy of mine's live stream. On Thursdays, Spartan John does a book reading, where basically he's going through every single Halo book from start to finish and reading them episodically every Thursday, followed by playing some Halo Infinite multiplayer. So far he's read the entirety of Halo Reach, and we're getting towards the end of Halo the Flood, and I believe he intends to read Halo First Strike next. I like to tune in for a couple of reasons. 1, I like to support my buddy. 2, I like a bit of background noise when I'm tinkering around the office and developing things for Project Mjolnir, or working on videos or scripts and the like. And 3, although I do have a pretty extensive knowledge of all of the books, it's nice to hear them again after all these years and kind of refresh my memory of some of the more subtle plot points that were going on in the respective books. And that is the inspiration of today's video. The excerpt you heard at the start of this episode was taken directly from Halo the Flood, and it is covering the events of Halo CE but in novel form, but also goes a good way to expanding the narrative, both with Chief's journey but also with other associated storylines that are happening around the Chief and around the ring during the events of Halo CE. And this specific excerpt is taken directly from the level The Library. Yes, all of our most favourite Flood level, that when played in Legendary absolutely doesn't kick your buttocks so hard that you end up wearing your arse as a hat. But in either case, this recent episode of Spartan John's livestream where he was reading Halo the Flood, he covered this particular scene. And again, my memory was refreshed on this very nuanced part of Halo lore. Staff Sergeant Marvin Mobuto. Now, we all know, as the Master Chief, when you're playing through the library, it is a hell of a task, particularly on higher difficulties, and we all know that the lore versus what we experience in-game is quite disparate in regards to the difficulty curve. For example, being shot with an overcharged plasma pistol in Legendary in Halo CE drains your shields entirely. In the lore, if a Spartan gets hit by an overcharged bolt from a plasma pistol, it drains the shields and then melts through their armour. So it's reasonable to expect that the actual lore journey of the Master Chief through the library is startlingly more difficult than even Legendary difficulty would be in Halo CE, which is why it's all the more dumbfounding that a completely unaugmented normal UNSC Marine made it nearly as far as the Master Chief had to to retrieve the activation index. And as Chief quite rightly says, the guy must have been one hardcore son of a bitch. But you see, as far as Staff Sergeant Marvin Mobuto is concerned, there's a few things I want to posit, a few theories I have that I just want to push forward in regards to exactly what was going on for Marvin and potentially what could have happened had he have actually made it. Now, first and foremost, it stands to reason that if Marvin was the first reclaimer that 343 Guilty Spark found and brought to the library, the Monitor's protocols in escorting a reclaimer to retrieve the activation index to then activate the Halo would only happen as a consequence of the Flood being released, which means that 343 Guilty Spark did not find Marvin Mobuto before the Flood's release in the level 343 Guilty Spark. Which means, strictly speaking, there's not a huge amount of time between the Flood being released, Marvin being taken to the library, ultimately succumbing to fatal injuries and not being taken over by the Flood, and then the Chief being chosen as the next viable reclaimer. So that really dials in the time span we're dealing with here, but we've also got to bear in mind then that when the Flood were initially released, obviously that would have brought 343 Guilty Spark's defensive protocols to a head, and he would have begun seeking out a reclaimer to perform those protocols. Which means by the time that 343 Guilty Spark found Marvin Mobuto on the other side of the ring and teleported him to the library, while there almost inevitably had to be Flood forms present within the library, one could argue that there wouldn't be quite the same quantity that there were by the time that the Master Chief made it to the library, meaning that strictly speaking, it's likely that Staff Sergeant Marvin Mobuto fought through less Flood than we observe the Master Chief fighting through, but that still doesn't lessen the monumental effort that it must have taken for a single unaugmented Marine to fight his way through the Flood. After some brief cutaways, the book does go on to say that the Chief passes through another metal door, is kind of held in an area where more Flood pour in, and then the doors release and he follows 343 Guilty Spark through a Flood-infested corridor, through another set of doors, and then onto the final lift that descends to the bottom of the library where he retrieves the activation index. So Marvin Mobuto made it strikingly far within the library. In fact, by all appearances, he made it literally on the right floor to board the lift that would then allow him to retrieve the index, but fell short by literally a corridor and two sets of doors. So again, while there were probably significantly less Flood in the library at this point, it still doesn't lessen the monumental achievement of Marvin Mobuto. And that inevitably leads my thought process to this point. What would have happened if Marvin Mobuto had actually made it? What if he had just a little bit of luck on his side and successfully made it to the activation index? What would have happened next? And how would those events have affected the wider playing out of events across the Halo universe? Well, first things first, if Marvin Mobuto had actually made it to the activation index, the Master Chief would not have been selected by 343 Guilty Spark to go and retrieve the activation index, so Chief would still be in the swamp with the other Marines at the end of 343 Guilty Spark and be picked up by Foehammer, and I would assume from there be transported back to Alpha Base, the forward operating base of the UNSC forces on the first Halo ring. Chief's presence at Alpha Base means he probably would have been there when the Flood attacked, which means that he would have been there when Private Wallace A. Jenkins arrived in Alpha Base with the Flood Horde. And as many of you remember, Private Wallace A. Jenkins is an unfortunate case where he was infected by a weakened Flood infection form that didn't take full control of his body and didn't kill him outright. In fact, Jenkins was aware of everything that was happening around him and could very, very occasionally overpower the weakened Flood intelligence inside of his body and for fleeting moments take brief control of his body, but generally speaking was just a passenger inside of his own body as it was twisted and mutilated and reappropriated for the Flood intelligence. It was Jenkins' helmet camera footage that the Master Chief retrieved while he was in the Flood research facility, so one would hope perhaps that the Master Chief would put two and two together and actually realise that this infected Flood form is actually Private Wallace A. Jenkins. And I would hope After gaining any intel that they could about the Flood or about the plans to attack Alpha Base, Chief would have put Jenkins out of his misery. This would also then mean that Chief would have been present when Antonio Silva attempted to take Jenkins onto the Truth and Reconciliation and then take the Truth and Reconciliation from the Halo directly to Earth, breaking the Cole Protocol by taking a Covenant ship that could very well have trackers or tracers on board the ship to find other human colonies, and also taking the single most virulent infectious disease mankind had ever encountered directly to our homeworld. So in that circumstance, I would hope then the Master Chief would somewhat pull rank and stop Silva from making such a stupid mistake, which would ultimately then mean that Lieutenant McKay wouldn't have had to sacrifice herself in order to destroy the Truth and Reconciliation to prevent that exact circumstance from coming to pass. But let's be honest, all of that is really kind of small fry in regards to the bigger narrative that's at play here. If Marvin had retrieved the activation index, 343 Guilty Spark would have transported him to the control room of the Halo. Now, this is when one of two things would happen. One, Marvin Mobuto would put the activation index into the console of the control room, and Cortana would step in exactly as she did in the mainline narrative to prevent the firing of the Halo. The problem after, however, is that without the Master Chief to retrieve her data chip and then get out of the control room and fight past the Sentinels, Marvin would have basically been stranded there with 343 Guilty Spark and a load of Sentinels as he attempted to remove Cortana and flee the control room, likely being cut down in the process by the Sentinels. At this point, 343 Guilty Spark would have the activation index code because he would have retrieved Cortana, dissected her, and found the activation code. Then, one of two things would happen as a consequence of that. One, 343 Guilty Spark would use the activation code himself, defying protocol, and activate the ring, killing the Flood, the Covenant, the UNSC forces, the Master Chief, and every other sentient being within 25,000 light years. Or, he would have then sought another reclaimer to use that activation code to activate the Halo. Now that could either be just another normal Marine, or it could have been the Master Chief, at which point the Master Chief would have discovered that the Monitor killed Marvin Mobuto and then dissected Cortana to retrieve the activation index code, meaning Chief would then turn on 343 Guilty Spark, and then we would have a similar series of events to what we had in the game, except Chief would be just doing most of this on his own, in having to go and find Keyes' command neural interface and activate the Pillar of Autumn's fusion reactors. But at that point, I'm not entirely convinced he'd have had the intimate knowledge of the inventory of the ship to know that there was a longsword still docked on the Pillar of Autumn, meaning that Chief would have died on Alpha Halo. Or, rewinding back to the second option of what could have happened if Marvin went to activate the Halos in the control center, at some point between Marvin retrieving the index and arriving at the control center, Chief may have returned to the control center to retrieve Cortana, meaning that either Chief would be in the control room as Marvin arrives with 343 Guilty Spark and thus stop him, or he would have left with Cortana, in which case Marvin wouldn't have known any different, would have activated the ring, and killed himself, all life on the ring, and all life within 25,000 light years. And it's at that point then that I look at Marvin Mobuto and the immense, insurmountable odds that he had stacked against him. It's just as well that he didn't make it through, because him dying within the library meant that 343 Guilty Spark had to come and find another reclaimer. And then all of the events of Halo CE played out the way in which they did, and both Cortana and Chief survived the destruction of the ring to continue the fight in Halo 2, Halo 3, and beyond. If Marvin had have made it through, it really only boils down to a couple of options. 1, the ring gets activated by Marvin. 2, the ring gets activated by 343 Guilty Spark after he killed Marvin and Cortana to retrieve the code, either by his direct activation or by finding another reclaimer. Or 3, the ring is prevented from firing, but then Chief has to lone wolf it in order to set off the Autumn's fusion reactors, but he wouldn't have made it off of Halo, which means that all of the events in Halo 2 and Halo 3 would not have played out the same way because they wouldn't have had the Master Chief there to swing the tide of the battle, meaning humanity would have become extinct. So, next time you're playing through the library, spare a thought for Staff Sergeant Marvin Mobuto, and thank him for the honourable sacrifice of not making it to the activation index, because if he had, piss poor odds for the rest of us. And until next time.